Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to Neuhaus Education Center's College Share 2022, featuring our speaker this evening, Angie Maxey. Before we jump in, I just want to share a little bit about Neuhaus Education Center for those who may not be familiar. If we go to the next slide, you'll see the information for our Family Support Office. And so a little bit about Neuhaus. We have a three-part mission. So the first is promoting reading success for all by providing evidence-based professional development to educators, all teachers of literacy, and especially those who teach struggling readers, which can be our readers with dyslexia. We have literacy certification pathways that prepare teachers and private therapists to teach specific Neuhaus curricula to learners with dyslexia. The second part of our mission is providing information resources to family members through the website, as well as hosting several seminars during the school year, such as College Share. And then third, we also have an evening program for adult learners who want to improve their reading and spelling. And so on the screen, you can see our email address and the phone number where you can reach us with your questions, and we look forward to hearing from you. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker this evening. So Angie Maxey, she serves as the Director of Access and Disability Services at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. She is a dedicated disability educator and an advocate for the advancement of individuals with disabilities. So in her current role at the University of St. Thomas, she provides leadership and support as a consultant to board and staff in educating members of the organization about access issues, and ensures that planning for access is incorporated into all organizational decisions, keeping in alignment with the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. In 2005, Angie began teaching in Houston area public schools, and she has spent her career developing and implementing programs that provide enhanced learning opportunities for diverse populations. So prior to joining the University of St. Thomas, she served as the District Section 504 Coordinator and Senior Manager of Dyslexia Services in Houston ISD, and worked collaboratively with all levels of the organization to develop operational systems, processes, procedures, and policies to increase the identification of students with disabilities and provide instructional support. Angie is also a proud graduate of both the University of Houston and the University of St. Thomas, where she completed her graduate studies. And outside of her role in education, she is a wife and mother of two. She supports adaptive sports programs with her son, who is active in the Special Olympics and Miracle League, in addition to serving as a Girl Scout troop leader with her daughter. So as you can see, she brings a wealth of experience and expertise. And tonight she is going to share with us about navigating that transition to college for a child who has a learning disability. As she goes through her presentation, please put the questions that come up for you in the chat, and we will have time for a Q&A at the end. And with that, I will turn it over to Angie.
Thank you so much for the intro. I am so happy to be here today and really excited about talking about this process to transition to college for students with disabilities. You know, I served in the K-12 grade levels for so many years, and I always wanted to prepare my seniors. I worked in high schools mostly, so most of my 16 years in K-12, most of it was in high school. And as a 504 coordinator, I always wanted to prepare the students as best I could for this transition to college, but I didn't quite understand it completely because I would hear different things from different universities. Well, since I've been here, I have learned so much about this process and really about the common denominators, right? Like, what are we going to see? What are the things that we're going to see across any university, and what does the law tell us that we have the right to, and how can we build those relationships? So I'm going to share a little bit with you today about what I've learned, and I'm here to answer any questions that you may have. So we'll dive in. Some questions that I want to make sure I answer for you today include, number one, do students with disabilities have a right to accommodations needed to access university programs? We're going to talk a little bit first about what our rights are and the laws that make up our rights as individuals with disabilities. Now, the second question I want to answer is what to expect when we are requesting accommodations. So as we request our accommodations, we want, I want you to be prepared, kind of know where to go in general, and who you're talking to and what kind of questions they may be asking you to make it through the process. And then finally, we're going to look at some accommodations. What is most commonly approved and what is, a little less commonly approved, and why. We'll kind of look at why and what are the barriers and the functional limitations that the schools are looking for when they're making decisions about approving accommodations. So first, I want to take a quick look at the law, right? What are the rights of students with disabilities in post-secondary education? We've got two main laws that we look at, Section 504 and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, these are two different laws, but they really do work together in order to give us a picture of what the students need. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, this was enacted in 1990. It's a civil rights law. These are both civil rights law. They both prohibit discrimination. The Americans with Disabilities Act, we see in all parts of our public life. This will be in our jobs, our schools, transportation, everything public and private. These are the things that you see that make our world around us accessible, including maybe doorways, when we see like a standard doorways, when we see ramps in buildings and elevators, to make public and private spaces accessible. And that's what we get from the Americans with Disabilities Act. When we get to Section 504, this is a law that protects us also from discrimination, and it's specifically for institutions that receive federal funding. And there is a section of 504 that specifically talks about the students' rights in higher education. And so these two laws together make up our rights. And basically, the bottom line is all programs must be accessible to the student. So a student that is otherwise qualified, not for anything but the disability, shouldn't be denied access to a university program, to all parts of the university program. And that's not just the classes, the courses that they might take, but also the events, the buildings, all parts of the university and university programs should be accessible. So the difference between what we see in K through 12 versus what we're going to see in higher ed are kind of summed up right here. And this is a document. I got these from a document from the Department of Education. And I think the primary difference is that a college does not have an obligation to identify students with handicaps. So they don't have an obligation to identify a disability as a school would. So in K-12, we've heard of FAPE. We understand that we've heard of Child Find. We understand that the school has a responsibility to identify students with disabilities and make sure that they're providing the services that the students need. Well, in college, there's no obligation on the part of the institution to identify the students. So it says here, in fact, Section 504 prohibits a post-secondary education recipient from making a pre-admission inquiry as to whether an applicant for admission is a handicapped person. So schools can't even ask if you have a disability or really what you need in relation to your disability. Now, what they do have an obligation to do in higher ed is to inform all of their applicants that they have the availability of services and academic adjustments based, for people with disabilities. So they are required to tell you, yes, this is available, this is the contact person. And a lot of times you'll see this you will see this in the admission process sometimes, but even in your classes, most universities that I've spoken to, that I've worked with, will see a general statement on every syllabus in every course across the campus that says, here is your contact information. And if you are a student with a disability who needs academic adjustments, this is who you need to contact, and they get that way you can get that process started. So every syllabus typically will have that, or somewhere on the school's website. Now, that's before admission, right? So before you're admitted, they cannot ask about disabilities. Now, after admission, the college may make confidential inquiries to the student to see if they are a person with a handicap or if they need any adjustments made, right? So they can ask these questions after the student has already been admitted to the program. Let's see. we go. So one thing that you'll want to look for in the university is a non-discrimination policy, right? This is going to give you an understanding of the school's actual policy, their local policy, and just anything that individualizes them beyond the general parts of the law that they will follow, right? So a non-discrimination policy is definitely going to have the contact information. It is going to have that first primary contact for the Disability Services Office, and it will tell you this is who you need to contact. Now, the second thing that you're going to see is a grievance policy. So they will lay out, the university's policy will lay out step by step what the grievance policy is and how to appeal any decisions, and who to contact if you are not satisfied or you feel like you're being discriminated against because of a disability. Now, the last point that I have on here is that it's so important to communicate directly with professors regarding implementation of accommodations. So there are no case managers like you might find under IDEA in special education. You may be used to a case manager contacting you and kind of following progress along the way. That is not a part of what a service that you'll find at a university. All right. So before we get into the next part, I just want to pause for a second. And if you have any questions that are specific to the law or the grievance policy, you can certainly write those in the chat. Take a moment to do that. And we're going to slide right into the second question I'm posing for you today, is what can students expect when requesting academic accommodations? All right, so there's typically going to be 3 steps, right? This is typically going to be the process that we see. First, you got to contact the Disability Services Office, right? Now, we've already mentioned they're not going to come looking for you. They're not going to suspect that you have a disability and refer you. Now that may happen, but there's not an obligation for that to happen, right? So if you need accommodations, you have got to initiate this process by going to the Disability Services Office. Do not be intimidated by the Disability Services Office. Absolutely don't reach out. That is what they are there for. They want to be accessible to you and they want to answer your questions. So please just contact them directly, and in writing is always the best. So contact them in writing, just letting them know, hey, I'd like to request accommodations. Can you tell me what the process is? It's just a really simple, short email, a quick question that'll prompt them to share with you the process. It might be on their website, it might be in some handbook somewhere, but the quick and easy way, if you've looked and like, I just don't know who to contact, I don't know where to go, find the contact of the Disability Services Office. Now that's going to be posted, that contact will definitely be on their website somewhere, right? But you want to contact that office in writing, a quick email. Hi, my name is Angie Maxey. I'm a student with disabilities and I'd like to request accommodations. Can you give me some information about that process? And they will reach out to you with all of the steps. So for instance, in my university, if someone reaches out with that type of email, it's very quick and easy for me to send them resources immediately to say, please register here. There's a form in my university, there's a form where they'll register and then they'll explain everything that's going on, explain the accommodations that the student is looking for, explain the functional limitations. And then there's a place to submit documentation, right? So that's really the second step. So first is just reach out and fill out any kind of registration or initial contact form that you need. Next, you want to make sure you're collecting all of your documentation that you need. Now, this might be a school evaluation. It might be a note from your healthcare provider. Sometimes the schools will have a letter that you can send to your doctor to have them fill out that kind of gives them some input on the functional limitations. But either way, find out, they'll let you know once you contact them about the process. They'll let you know if they have a form. Or you can get just information from your healthcare provider or school evaluation. Now, it may not be enough just to have your school evaluation. You may need multiple points, and that just depends on what the student's condition is. And then finally, you're going to have an interview, right? You're going to schedule an appointment with the Disability Services Office for an interview to review your request. So just about every accommodation request is going to be paired with a student, a live interview with the student where the student will have an opportunity to explain the barriers that they're facing, explain their condition and how it's impacting their functioning. Okay, so the student interview is going to be the primary source of documentation for most universities. Now, this guidance comes from the Department of Education. They tell us that that student interview, the student's account of what they're experiencing and how their disability impacts them, impacts their functioning, that's going to be the primary source of documentation. Now, they'll also need some additional documentation, like just to clearly identify the disability, what is the condition of the student. But when you're in this interview, you want to be prepared to identify the barrier. So prepare yourself. You want to know. So take some time to reflect and figure out what your barriers are. If you're asking for an accommodation that's going to provide you access, then what is keeping you from accessing the curriculum? And you've got to really pinpoint what that barrier is so that you can align it with your request for an accommodation. Okay, so every accommodation is accommodating access, right? So we've got to identify what is the barrier that is related to my disability that is keeping me from accessing the content, from accessing the course successfully, right? So know your barrier before you go into that meeting. And you want to be able, the student will be able to describe the functional limitation to a major life function. Okay, so describing that barrier and understanding how your disability is creating a functional limitation. Now, under Section 504 and the ADA tells us that the definition of a disability is a physical or mental impairment that creates a substantial limitation to a major life activity. Right. And those words are very important because that's what schools use to identify if a student is eligible for services at all. So you want to be able to share your functional limitations, be able to talk about it, be ready to say, what is it that is creating that barrier for me? How does my disability create a functional limitation? And not just what is the functional limitation, it must be a substantial functional limitation, and substantial is measured by how it compares to non-disabled peers, right? So again, we want to be able to speak to these two things in particular. How is it creating a barrier, and how is my disability creating a substantial limitation to a major life function? All right, when the student has this interview, now parents, I get this question all the time. Can parents come to the interview? The student can invite anyone they like. Well, that's what I do here. I can't imagine anybody saying, no, you're not allowed to bring anybody to the meeting with you. So I imagine if the student wants to bring somebody, that's pretty common practice. The parent can come with them, but the communication is really going to be between the student and the school, right? The disability services professional that will be at the school conducting the interview. The parent may explain, oh, he does this or she does this, and she has trouble with this. We really want to hear it from the student. We need to hear that the student is saying that they have a barrier. So take some time to really reflect and be able to articulate what the functional limitations are. What barriers are you experiencing? Now, with the documentation, you will need, of course, documentation from a healthcare provider that's going to clearly indicate the condition of the student. So we're looking for a diagnosis, and also we want to see it reflect the status of the student's current functional limitation. So typically when we see evaluations, we'll see the actual evaluation with scores, and there'll be a clear indicator of different areas saying, above average, below average, or average functioning in different areas. Different evaluations, depending on the condition, may look differently, but what we're looking for is that kind of scale. Sometimes schools will have their own forms that they provide for you, and they'll have a little scale. They'll have the major life functions, for instance, concentration, and they'll say, is concentration Is concentration limited by the student's disability? And you might, the healthcare provider might answer no, or they might say, yes, it is a mild impact on concentration, or no, there's a severe impact on concentration. And so we want to look at that functional limitation. So it's not quite enough to just have a diagnosis. A diagnosis on its own is not a disability. The diagnosis is what tells us it tells us the condition. So that is the first part. Is there a physical or mental impairment? Yes, we've answered that question. But in order for it to be a disability, it must be a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. That functioning piece is required for eligibility. We have to have a clear picture of that functional limitation. And again, it's not just based on the documentation. That student interview is so important as well. So between those two pieces, again, that student interview and the documentation that you get from your doctor, it should tell a story. It should paint a complete picture of the needs of the student. All right, so before we get into some commonly approved or denied accommodations, do we want to break for a few questions? Do we have any questions in the chat?
There is one question. It says, is there a list of colleges, universities that are known to be easier to work with students that have a need for an accommodation?
Ooh, that's a good question. I can find a list, I'm sure. I think there's a book. I can't remember the title of it right now, but I think there's a book that I saw online recently, and so I'll pull out that title. Thank you for that question. So what are the most commonly approved or denied accommodations? Let's jump into this section here. There is a document that comes from the Department of Education also about auxiliary aids and post-secondary institutions being required to provide auxiliary aids and services for students with disabilities. This is the list that they provide, again, from the Department of Education in this document. This is very easily searchable. I've also linked it here. I can share the link in the chat here in a minute. But it gives some information about the responsibilities of the university to require auxiliary aids. So you'll see on the list here, a lot of it has to do with communication, right? So taped text, note takers, interpreters, readers, video text display, television enlargers, calculators that talk, Braille. So I'll kind of let you take a look here, but we see a lot of them have to do with communication. And I think that it's important to note that when we're communicating, or if we have a disability that's related to communication, there are a lot of rights associated with this, and there are a lot of tools that the universities can provide to kind of fill those gaps and bridge that barrier of communication, whether it's reading, writing, speaking. There are a lot of options. Now, we want to always look for, one thing I always look for is the path to independence, right? Which support, which accommodation is going to allow the student to be as independent as possible. So, of course, you see on here a lot of technology. And again, the technology use is so important because it allows the student to engage with their accommodation as much or as little as they need, and not to rely on somebody else necessarily. So for instance, at the top there, it talks about note takers. It mentions note takers. Note takers, that's pretty popular. I think in a lot of schools, you'll see that they have peer note takers, other people in the class who are assigned to take notes, and then they share copies of those notes. But more and more, what we're seeing are universities moving to technology for note taking. There's new technology that helps with notes, that transcribes lectures, that helps to build outlines of notes for students. And through this technology, students can, again, they could be more independent and really be able to engage with their work on their own terms and not rely on other student note takers. So there's a lot of technology and things to explore. Of course, you got to understand that takes a little bit of a learning curve too. So if you want to be as independent as possible and be ready when you get out of school to be competitive in the workforce, that's what you're going to need to do, is really understand, reflect on your disability, understand what your limitations are, and really go out there and search for what is right for you. What skills do you need to develop? What technology do you need to engage with, so that you can be as independent as possible? So when you're having your interview and you're preparing to ask for accommodations, these are some that we see that are most commonly approved. Extended time on exams. If you have a learning disability or some kind of data that shows that your processing is not on average or not above average, then we may see a need for extra time on tests. Now, again, we always go back to that barrier, right? Is the barrier time? What information can you provide, whether it's documentation from an evaluation or from your own telling? How can you get the point across that time is a barrier for you? Now, very clearly, just to add in here, the barrier of time is very different from the barrier of time management, right? So if I have a barrier of time because it takes me a little bit longer to process information, it takes me longer to read information, I may need extended time. But if I am having some, maybe anxiety, or I'm having some problems with procrastination, that may be an issue of time management versus the barrier of time. Time management, we would address that barrier a little bit differently, right? We want to develop those skills. How can we manage our time better? Do you have tools like a calendar that you can use for reminders? Can you, work with a coach that's going to help with executive functioning? So that's a different way to look at accommodations. So again, when you're going into those meetings, you want to be prepared. If you're asking for some of these accommodations, you got to understand what is the barrier that's leading you to ask for this accommodation. So extended time is one on exams. I want to focus on this one a little bit because this is probably the most approved accommodation that I've seen. Now, this would be for timed tests. This is our timed assignments, right? Not necessarily just exams, but anything that's timed could get extended time. This is not the same as extending time on due dates. And so we'll get to that one in just a second, but make a note of that. So the use of laptops for tests and exams, the use of laptops for taking notes as well in class, those are common accommodations. Calculators for tests and exams, especially a 4-function calculator if there's a learning disability in math. Permission to make audio recordings of class. So some schools will allow you to make audio recordings, but then you'll have to sign an audio recording agreement. And that's pretty standard, right? Because we want to make sure that the students have the right to audio record, but that it's used for studying and not for sharing or anything like that. A reduced course load. This is approved at some times, but then also we understand that there are financial aid implications, and there's also implications with housing sometimes if there's a requirement to hold a full load of courses. And so you'll have to provide some data to indicate why a reduced course load is needed. Priority registration for courses, copies of notes from a classmate, and then access to things like audiobooks, voice recognition software, text-to-speech programs. And again, these technology accommodations are very common because the student is able to engage with them on their own and be very independent. So some that are less commonly approved. So extension of deadlines is definitely less commonly approved. Extension of deadlines is going to be something that that is more of a time management issue. If we procrastinate and we always need that extra day because, I always have an issue with procrastinating and I just can't get started on an assignment. I have trouble getting started. And the next thing I know, the deadline has passed. That is not typically going to be approved for an extension of a deadline. Now, if a student has a medical need and maybe they have a lot of medical appointments or they have a condition that is exacerbated from time to time and they may have, be out for, 2 or 3 days at a time, those might be accommodations that are approved, or that might be a reason for an extension of deadlines. And that would be, again, on a case-by-case basis, not just like an open forum of an open accommodation to extend deadlines all the time. The reduced course load, that one, I think it made it on that other list as well, but I wanted to just really focus on this one. This one's going to have a different level of documentation, very specific documentation that they'll be looking for, that schools will be looking for to reduce a course load. Again, a lot of times it's going to be based on a medical need, a need for therapy, a need for, if a student has a condition that requires a lot of time seeing other service providers and things like that, they may not have time for a full load, or if they have a functional limitation because of a mobility issue, things like that, things take longer. A reduced course load would be most appropriate, but it wouldn't necessarily be approved for mental health concerns and things of that nature. And the last one I have is alternative exam formats. So, a lot of one word that you'll hear a lot during the process is the essential components of the course, right? The essential components of the course must stay intact, right? The school will not modify what is expected to get a credit on a course. So they'll provide accommodations, but they're not going to modify the outcomes. And so the essential components of the course can't really change. Now, it would be depending on the course, it'd be very dependent on what the course is, but alternative exam formats are not typically granted because if the output that you're, presenting to show mastery, to demonstrate your mastery, is typically going to be an essential component of the course. So sometimes there may be a course that is available, that might be available, and that would be done in collaboration with the school, with the instructor, the specific instructor, maybe the dean or the department chair from that organization would be very involved in making this question. But what is important is that when you go to these meetings, they should not tell you, no, we don't do that, right? So there shouldn't necessarily be a conversation that doesn't happen, right? So if you're requesting something, they should consider every request. So if you're requesting something, even if it's something that's less commonly approved, there shouldn't really be a time where you say, no, we don't do that ever. They should look at your request and review your request and then come back with an answer. So sometimes the answers are pretty quick. For example, I'll have students who come in, they have the documentation that supports, extended time, it supports, breaks as needed, if they need to take a break in class and walk out and come back, those types of things, I might have the documentation that I need for those. But then if they're asking for something to change in a course, I would need to get the instructor involved. Right. So they're going to have a conversation about it. But if your disability services professional tells you, no, we don't do that, I would maybe follow up in writing and then ask them to consider it. But you won't typically hear people say, no, we don't do that. That's not really typical, because they have to interact with the data, interact with you, interact with a committee of relevant people in order to come to a decision. So it shouldn't be a decision that's right off of the cuff without reviewing your documentation first. All right, let's look at other services. So this is really good to know too. Other services when you're in school, like K-12, there's tutoring available. There are study skills available. Sometimes there'll be learning specialists, case managers, different types of people who will come in and help, interventionists that'll come and help with programs, mentor programs. But that's not always necessarily available at the college level. So when you're looking for schools, these are things that you should be interested in and looking at when you're making your decision, if you think this is something that you need, right? So you can go, again, through their websites, or just contact the department directly and ask them, what kind of services do you have? For example, tutoring. Do you have any tutoring? Do you have mentoring programs? Do you have any coaching programs for students who need support with executive functioning? A lot of schools have these programs, so they may be at an extra cost or they may be included. So for example, at the University of St. Thomas, my closest resources that I refer students to all the time is we have a counseling program. It is included in the students' in the student's tuition. It is a service that is available to all of our students. So we have licensed counselors, they're clinical mental health counselors who are here on our staff and will take appointments with students or consultations and can make referrals. So that counseling service is it's not necessarily typical for every school, but that's one that I work with, that I partner with in our office. Another one is tutoring services. So sometimes tutoring services are for an extra fee, but again, at St. Thomas, it is included, which is one of the things that I love about being here, because it's so accessible. It's so easy for me to say, hey, go talk to tutoring, or let me assign you to a coach. We have student mentors. We have peer mentors that work with our Dean of Students office. We have staff coaches as well that are assigned to all the students. So you'll find that a lot of universities have very similar programs, because these are really great practice and great supports, especially for our students with disabilities. So take a look at all of those things as you're making your decisions as well. And those are great questions to ask. These are great things to ask about if you are if you're, in that interview process, or even if you're still in the admissions process, you can ask about these things. Now, one question I get a lot is, should we reveal if we have a disability during the admissions process? And, that is, I think absolutely yes is my answer. If you are, if you want to share this as a part of who you are, if it is part of your identity, it is part of who you are, it is something that you want to share about yourself, it is not necessarily going to be, or it's not going to be a decision-making factor, right? A lot of schools, I have not had the experience where any student has told me that they felt that they were discriminated against during that admissions process. If you're not comfortable sharing, don't share it. It's a very personal decision, but I would not say that that is something that you need to hide. If it is something that you identify as a student with a disability, this is something that is an identifying characteristic for you that you want to share because it is a part of your story, it is a part of who you are, and you want to share it as part of your admissions process, I would say absolutely that is something that you can talk about. But again, it's a very personal choice. And so students can, that's something that you have to reflect on and kind of make your own decision on if that's the way you want to go. So I have some key takeaways just to kind of take a look and refer back to some of the things we talked about. So number one, colleges do not have the same legal obligations as high schools. This is so important to note. They do not have the obligation to find students with disabilities, to identify them and provide services, right? They do not provide evaluations for learning and thinking differences. Colleges are not going to be required to provide evaluations. So what they'll do is they'll evaluate the paperwork that you bring. So if you self-identify, the student would bring their documentation, and the colleges are going to review that documentation to determine if it meets that definition of a disability. So again, the definition of a disability, again, a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, right? So if what you're bringing, if what you can tell about yourself and the documentation that you bring paints that picture, then they're going to say, yes, you are eligible as a student with disability for accommodations. And so then they'll dig deeper to find out what are the actual barriers and what are the best accommodations. Number 3 on here tells us students must register as a student with disabilities to get accommodations. Absolutely, the student must register as a student with disabilities. Nobody is going to come and find you. Your instructor isn't necessarily obligated to refer you. Now they may refer you, but they're not required to. So they have not failed to meet their obligations if you don't identify yourself. So please do not be shy. Do not be the student that says, oh, I think I'll be fine. I'll wait till next semester, or I'll register if I need to later. Don't wait. Don't register later if you need to. Take the time, go and have that conversation and go ahead and register. You want to make sure you're doing everything that you need up front so that you can be ready for a successful semester. Now, accommodations are not going to be retroactive. So you won't be able to go in and say, hey, I have ADHD, I have dyslexia, I need some accommodations. Here's my evaluation, but I failed my test last Tuesday. Like the accommodations are not going to be retroactive. So don't wait. Is definitely my number one recommendation. Don't wait. Just reach out with a really quick email. Again, hi, my name is Angie Maxey. I am a student with a disability and I'd like to request accommodations. Can you please tell me about the process for registering? It's a very quick and simple email. Number 4 on here, the requirements for documentation in college are different than K-12. And that's really rooted in that evaluation requirement, right? So in K-12, if they suspect a disability, if the school, if anyone suspects a disability, the school will meet to determine if an evaluation is needed. But in college, that is not a requirement, right? So they're not going to evaluate. They're going to be looking for that documentation to come to them from the student. The student has to bring it on their own. And number 5, again, we're just a reminder there that there are no case managers. So we're not going to have goals like through the Disability Services Office. There won't be goals or a case manager that is monitoring your progress. Now there are, systems in the universities that are monitoring student progress and that are available for support, but it's the student's responsibility to really go out and engage with those resources. So if it's not the Disability Services Office, it may be the Dean of Students office, it may be the counseling office, it may be the Tutoring Services Center. A lot of schools have access centers or success centers. But again, there's not going to be a case manager that's following your progress. Each student is really going to need to take on that responsibility and not be shy. So advocating for yourself is really important. Number 6 here, different schools offer different levels of support, right? So as you are researching schools, please don't assume that if you went to one school, oh, I went to this school, I've got, I've got, these are the accommodations that I got when I went to this school. Now I'm going to transfer to the other school and I'll just take them this documentation. That is not the case. Different schools have different levels of support. They're going to have a different decision-making process for each campus. So even though your documentation may have you receive certain accommodations at one university, transferring to another university does not guarantee that you're going to have those exact same accommodations. They may have, again, a different decision-making process that aligns to that specific university. Maybe it aligns to the mission, the vision of that specific school, and the essential components are different for different schools. The essential components of the academics are maybe different. And if they have those different views, their decision-making process may also be different. So please don't assume that if you get it, and maybe you've taken some classes through the community college or some dual credit courses while you were in high school and you've got certain accommodations. It's not safe to assume 100% that you're going to get those exact same accommodations at any other college. So please do your research, contact the different schools, understand what their programs are and their levels of support and what documentation is needed at each individual school. And finally, parents are no longer automatically in the loop. So parents, you want to help to advocate for your students, but the best thing that you can do is really teach them how to advocate, teach them how to write a really good email, teach them how to just not wait and be proactive about what their needs are. I think that's probably the most important takeaway, that parents, you're doing a service to your child if you are allowing them to be as independent as possible through this initial process. Now parents can be there, right? Parents can be there all along the way, but giving the students the opportunity to say, no, you send the email. No, you need to log in. It's your registration form, and not filling out the registration forms for them, maybe with them, maybe supporting them when they're filling out that paperwork. But that first step, those first parts, I recommend 100%. My top recommendation is that parents start to gradually release the students to being very independent through this process. It's not a difficult process, but it will be, there are steps, right? We have to understand that there are steps in the process. And the student will get a lot of value out of going through that process on their own with the parent support, of course. But if parents fill it out for them, like if if they say, oh, what's the first step? Fill out this registration form. Okay, what's your password so I can fill it out for you? Don't go there. Don't do that. Let them fill it out and just show them your support and really celebrate once they get it all done on their own. All right, y'all. That's all I've got for today, but I am excited to answer any questions that you guys may have.
Hi, Angie. A question in the chat. How recent does your testing need to be?
That's a great question. So it's going to be different actually for every university. So that's one of those important things that you want to look at when you're contacting the schools. They might have it on their website. They might not. You might have to reach out to them and by email, just say, hey, this is, I've got an evaluation and it's dated here. What I look for, I can tell you, and what is just good practice for disability service professionals is to have an understanding of the functional limitation. So if you have an evaluation that is, from second grade, and we know that that condition isn't gone. You still have the condition, right? Maybe you were diagnosed or you have the condition of dyslexia that was established second grade, third grade. That report, that evaluation is not going to share your functional level, the current functional level. So if you have maybe that initial evaluation and something else that would help to support that, that functional understanding, again, the student's account is going to be a part of it. And so for me, like I just talk to them, I ask them all the questions and kind of help to fill the gaps to get an understanding of that functional level. But another school may require something in writing. So they may require maybe, I would say if you have the evaluation, but then maybe the most recent 504 plan or IEP that has like the, current functional levels, but maybe the actual evaluation was from long ago. Does that make sense? So it can be a combination of documents. But what I would tell you is I would not go out and spend thousands of dollars on a new evaluation until you've gone through the process and let them tell you, you must have this, right? You must have this additional piece or this new piece, because sometimes it'll be enough just by explaining. But again, when you're looking at your information, do you see a diagnosis, like a clearly stated condition? And do you see the functional level, the current level of functioning in the documentation? And if you see that, you should be good. And it could, again, a combination of documents, it could be.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next question. How does a professor know if a student is registered with student services and has accommodations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, schools will be very different, but one common thing that I see is the student is really responsible in a lot of ways for making this happen. So I use a program, data management program. It's called AIM. And this is probably the most used program. Oh, my camera's going kind of fuzzy, sorry. It's probably the most used program that I've seen among universities. And so with this program, the students will go in and they register and they have complete access to their profile and to who they send their accommodation letters to. So literally the student would log in, send their accommodation letter. They would choose the accommodation and say, okay, for this class, I want to send the instructor these accommodations, and then send. And they're going to get a timestamp, and that letter is going to go out automatically to the professors. But this is a really good question, because just because they got that letter, it's not always necessarily enough, right? You want to send the letter, and now it may be in a system where the student sends it. It may be where the disability services professional, that person sends it. You may have like a specialist or something in that department that takes the request from the student and notifies faculty. They may have a system where the students go in and print their own letter and distribute it on their own, either by email or in person. But what I'm seeing mostly now is that this is automated. There's a database where a student can go in and send the letter, and it's time stamped. Now, that's not enough. So you'll send that letter, but I always tell our students to follow up immediately with your professors and just say, hey, I just wanted to check to confirm that you got my accommodation letter. Some of the accommodations that I plan to use on a regular basis are going to be the audio recording of lectures and testing in the testing center. So please let me know if you have any guidance for me regarding those, the implementation of those accommodations. Just a really quick email where you're just connecting with that professor, or I'm going to stop by and see you after class tomorrow to talk about these. Please let me know if you have any questions about implementing these accommodations. Now, students don't have to share their disability. They don't have to share what their diagnosis is, any of that information. All of that is very confidential. But what they should share is, how does this look in your class? And just a real quick, easy example. If a student can audio record, all right, okay, you can audio record lectures. One instructor might say, can you just remind me every class, just give me a little signal to let me know that you're going to be recording that day so that I remember that you're recording, just notify me. Another one might say, I'm just always going to assume that you're recording. Another one might say, hey, today we have a special topic. And so because it's a special topic or because we have a guest speaker, we're not going to record today. And that may be that, and that's okay. You know, and there'll typically be an agreement that says all these things. But again, you want to talk to each individual professor to understand what they expect, and they can get a better understanding of what you need. Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm hearing just that communication is kind of the key throughout this.
Absolutely.
Our next question, can private colleges deny accommodations like private K through 12 schools can?
That is a great question. So private K through 12 schools. So, okay, so here's the thing. 504 is required if you receive federal funding. Okay. Most universities are going to receive federal funding. I think more universities are going to receive federal funding, even private universities, than like a K through 12 school. A K through 12 school might operate without federal funding. But if that K through 12 private school receives federal funding, then they are required to implement accommodations. Now, that doesn't mean that they are bound to IDEA and having to provide, you know, modifications and an IEP and all of this. So they don't necessarily have to do that. But under Section 504, they do have a responsibility to not discriminate and provide access. So accommodations would be required even in K-12 private schools, although it may look different than it does in a public school, right? But again, it's based on the federal funding. So for example, the University of St. Thomas, we are a Catholic university, private school, but it is, you know, we receive federal funding. So we may have funding that was related to COVID. We may have funding that is, you know, just related to, like, we receive students who receive federal financial aid, things like that. So we are, we operate under Section 504.
All right, we have a question from a student. It says, does it matter if you take more than 4 years to get a college degree?
No, absolutely not. Take your time. Take your time. It doesn't matter if you take more than that. So typically a school will just do the interview process once and set up your accommodations. And then those are your accommodations for the rest of the time. So the only change would be if there's a change in your needs. So if your condition changes and you need additional accommodations or something, you can always request another meeting and just say, hey, my condition has changed. I have this updated documentation and I want to now request these additional accommodations to support me. That is absolutely perfectly fine and a part of the process. But typically, if you come in the first time and you have your meeting, you set up an accommodation plan and that's working for you, what you'll do is every semester, you'll send that faculty notification out to your new professors each year. And again, it's very student driven. So there'll be some kind of mechanism for the student to either request somebody to send it or the student can send it themselves. And it's typically one or the other, but the schools are moving more and more to where the students just send a request in a system and then it automatically sends the faculty notification. So every semester you'll have to send it out. Nobody's going to remember for you in the disability services office and say, hey, I'm going to send out that letter for the student because they've enrolled in new courses. So they won't do that because we've got, you know, information, like we won't release your information unless you are prompting it. So the student each semester would enroll in their new courses and then say, hey, these are my new professors to send the letters out to. But the decision-making process, that is only going to happen the one time.
So this question kind of connects. Do I then, if I'm the student, do I then have to use all the accommodations that have been stated or for which I qualify, or can I just use different ones when I need them?
Yeah, you can just use the different ones when you need them. It's the student, again, student is in control there. The student can engage with their accommodations as much as possible. A lot of the accommodations that you're going to see are going to be things that the student needs to implement. If you have a accommodation for audio recording lectures, nobody is going to remind you to audio record your lecture. You're going to have to remember and make it your own practice, because that is your, you're allowed to audio record. That's your accommodation, is you're allowed to do that. Let me think of another example, like taking your tests in the testing center. If you can take a test in a quiet area with no distractions in the testing center, or extended time on your test, if you don't make those arrangements, your instructor is not going to make those arrangements for you. They don't have to provide you those. You have to request them and make sure that you're communicating. So even though they get that letter that says you're allowed to have all of these accommodations, you'll still have to kind of, invoke them each time, if that makes sense.
All right, I think we have one last one. So this question is, can you talk to the student service office during the admissions college tour process? And kind of, I would add to that too, is there any other department or that you think people should consider talking to as they're visiting? Yeah,
That's a great question. And yes, I do that all the time. So it's not a typical part of our process to where they'll engage with me every time. But when families ask, I love being a part of the process. And so I have a really good relationship with our admissions office, and I let them know, like, if you've got a student and you hear anything about a disability, you connect me in an email, when you're doing your campus tour, make me a stop on your tour. But you can request that is, I'd tell them, like, bring them to me. I want to see them. But, even if the school doesn't necessarily do that, you can definitely say, hey, when we're on tour or when I'm there that day, would it be possible to meet with somebody from the Disability Services Office? And they can arrange that for you, or they'll give you the contact information. But absolutely, I think that those are great questions to ask during that admissions process.
All right. Well, Angie, thank you so much for joining us for College Share this evening. We appreciate you sharing your wisdom, and we will have this posted on the website as well. So everyone attending, if you think of other people who you think would benefit from this information, we'll get that information on how you can share it. And if other questions come up, you can contact Angie. You can contact us at the Neuhaus Family Support Office, and we thank you for your time.
Thanks, everyone.